Imagine walking alone through a dense forest, hearing nothing but the sound of branches cracking beneath your feet. Now imagine discovering that this very place was the scene of unspeakable horrors. At the end of the 1980s, something sinister lurked in the depths of Molalla Forest in Oregon. What drives someone seemingly ordinary, a mechanic, a family man, to become one of the most brutal killers in recent history? How did he manage to maintain a facade of normality while hiding such a macabre secret? How many chances did the justice system have to stop him before it was too late? This is the case of Dayton Leroy Rogers, known as the Molalla Forest Killer, a man who led a double life for years, deceiving friends, neighbors, and even his own family. What makes this story even more disturbing is that Dayton didn't start his criminal path with murders. In fact, he had displayed extremely violent behavior from a very young age, but somehow managed to escape harsher consequences. How could someone with such a dangerous history remain free? Why were the warning signs ignored? And how would a simple license plate become the key to unraveling one of the darkest and most mysterious cases in the state of Oregon? Dayton Leroy Rogers was more than just a criminal. He was a master manipulator, hiding and selecting his victims with terrifying precision. He walked the streets like any ordinary man, but concealed violent desires that only found relief among the lonely trees of Molalla Forest. He was no stranger to the police. Before his most notorious crimes, Dayton had already been reported for violent attacks. Yet somehow, he always managed to escape. Was it negligence, failures in the system? Or did Dayton simply know how to exploit the loopholes of the law? In this video, we will explore all the details of this story, from Dayton's troubled childhood, his first attacks, to the horrific murders that shocked the local community and the world. You will understand the traumas, the failures of the system, the building of a psychological profile, and how Dayton's obsession with control led him to commit acts that defy any rational explanation. Prepare yourself for a disturbing journey, full of twists, shocking details, and questions that may never have complete answers. But one thing is certain: after hearing this story, you will never look at the forest the same way again. To understand how someone like Dayton Leroy Rogers became the Molalla Forest Killer, we need to look at the beginning, to the early years of his life, where the traits of a future criminal began to take shape. Dayton was born in 1953 in the state of Idaho, United States. From an early age, his life was marked by abuse, violence, and an extremely dysfunctional family environment. His home, which should have been a place of protection and safety, was in fact a field of instability and fear. Reports indicate that Dayton's mother exhibited strange, often disturbing behaviors. She fluctuated between being excessively controlling and emotionally cold. But what truly haunts Dayton's story are his father's actions. Dayton's father was known for his brutality. Inside the home, he not only verbally and physically assaulted the family, but also displayed cruel behavior toward the family pets. According to records and testimonies, Dayton's father killed the family pets, including dogs and cats, in front of the children. These scenes left deep emotional scars and created a perverse association in Dayton's mind between pain, power, and control. Psychologists and criminology experts point out that traumas like these, experienced during childhood, can be determining factors in the development of violent and antisocial behaviors. In Dayton's case, this manifested as a growing fascination with power and domination, feelings that, over the years, would merge with sexuality in a distorted and dangerous way. During adolescence, Dayton began to show clear signs that something was very wrong. Classmates described him as a withdrawn, socially isolated boy who, at specific moments, displayed aggressive behavior and blank stares. While other teenagers sought friendships and hobbies, Dayton increasingly immersed himself in violent fantasies, fueled by the chaos he experienced at home. At 18 years old, now an adult, these thoughts crossed the line from imagination to reality. In an episode that, unfortunately, was ignored by the authorities, Dayton lured a young woman to a wooded area and brutally stabbed her. The attack was savage, but surprisingly, The girl survived. Showing impressive presence of mind, she managed to convince Dayton to take her to a hospital, where she received medical attention and reported her attacker Dot at that moment. The justice system had its first major opportunity to interrupt the growing cycle of violence, but instead of being sentenced to an appropriate prison term, Dayton received a clinical diagnosis: schizoid personality disorder. This disorder, characterized by social isolation, difficulty forming emotional bonds, and a tendency toward emotional detachment, was used as justification for Dayton to avoid prison. He was sentenced only to probation and supervised psychiatric treatment. But what no one seemed to realize at the time was that the problem went far beyond Dayton's reserved behavior while officially under supervision. In reality, his darkest thoughts continued to grow. The obsession with power and the distortion of pleasure through pain intensified, fueled by a sense of impunity. Unfortunately, Dayton was not just emotionally distant. He had already crossed the line between violent thoughts and actions. The court's decision, although based on medical reports, turned out to be a grave mistake. Dayton did not become a rehabilitated man. On the contrary, that was merely the first of many missed opportunities to interrupt his escalation of violence. And while the authorities believed the case was resolved, Dayton was already planning his next moves. Dayton's story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. After avoiding prison for the brutal attack on the young woman who managed to survive, Dayton Leroy Rogers seemed to have bought himself time, enough time for his violent impulses to mature and become even more dangerous. A few months after the incident in the woods, Dayton struck again. This time, the targets were two teenage girls walking peacefully through an isolated area. Using his manipulative skills and his appearance as an ordinary man, Dayton managed to lure the girls into his car. What began as a friendly conversation quickly turned into a nightmare. Inside the vehicle, Dayton revealed his true nature. Armed and increasingly confident in his ability to escape consequences, he tied up the girls, threatened them, and took them to a remote area where he physically and sexually assaulted them. But this time, fate intervened in an unexpected way. During the trip, Dayton's car got stuck in a muddy stretch of road. The opportunity, though risky, was enough for the girls to escape and call for help. What could have been the beginning of a long series of murders was momentarily interrupted. Authorities located Dayton and arrested him, once again holding in their hands the chance to stop his violent trajectory. Unlike the first case, the evidence was more concrete that the victims survived. Their testimonies were consistent, and the physical marks of the assaults left no room for doubt. Moreover, Dayton's recent history already raised red flags about his dangerousness. For a while, it seemed that justice would finally prevail. Dayton was declared a dangerous individual. It seemed obvious that someone with this history and behavioral pattern should remain off the streets. But what happened next surprised and outraged many. In 1974, after a brief period in custody, Dayton was released. Despite the mental disorder diagnosis, despite the history of assaults and attempted kidnappings, the system once again failed to act with the necessary rigor. Dayton returned to society, apparently ready to rehabilitate. In practice, he was simply waiting for the right moment to take the next step. The most frightening part is that, in the eyes of many, Dayton seemed to have changed. He got married, became a father, and worked as a mechanic. He wore the mask of a respectable citizen, attended local events, and was seen as a hardworking and dedicated man. But all of this was a facade. Behind the polite gestures and reserved smile remained a man consumed by violent fantasies and an uncontrollable desire for domination. Those first crimes and the ease with which he escaped punishment reinforced Dayton's sense of invincibility. It was as if the system was on his side, turning a blind eye to the growing danger he posed. The time he spent free was enough for him to perfect his approach, observe his future victims, and silently feed the darkest side of his mind, the system's failures, the naivety of those around him, and his ability to manipulate created the perfect environment for Dayton to continue down his criminal path. And so, while society carried on with its routine, Unaware of the lurking danger, Dayton Leroy Rogers meticulously plotted, step by step, the crimes that would transform him into one of the most brutal serial killers in Oregon's history. While society saw him as just a mechanic, husband, and family man, Dayton Leroy Rogers was hiding a second life, a dark life fueled by violent and uncontrollable desires. During the 1980s, Dayton seemed to have settled down, married, with a young son, and working in his own workshop. He gave the impression of being the typical hardworking man from rural America. He attended local events, did small repairs for neighbors, and in the eyes of those who didn't know what was hidden behind that facade, he was a trustworthy person. But once night fell and the streets of Portland emptied, Dayton transformed. It was during this period that he began to frequent the area known as Portland's red light district, a neighborhood marked by prostitution, drugs, and people in vulnerable situations. There, far from the watchful eyes of his neighbors and the appearance of a good citizen, Dayton felt free to give in to his darkest impulses. In this area, he became known by a curious nickname, Steve the Gambler. Using false names and always displaying a confident attitude, Dayton frequented bars and prostitution hotspots, earning the trust of the women who worked on the streets. But his obsession wasn't limited to sex alone. He had a peculiar and disturbing fetish, a fixation with feet. This fetish, seemingly harmless, evolved into something far more sinister in Dayton's case. He didn't just admire women's feet. He saw them as a symbol of power, submission, and, above all, control. This detail would later become one of the trademarks of his crimes. Dayton's modus operandi followed a cold and calculated pattern. First, he gained the victim's trust, usually women in vulnerable situations, many of them sex workers. Then, he offered them a ride, drinks, or money, taking them to his truck or isolated areas. Inside the vehicle, Dayton's true nature was revealed. He tied them up with shoelaces, wires, and ropes, using simple but effective tools to completely restrain the women's movements. In many cases, he brutally assaulted them under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Dayton alternated moments of extreme violence with apparent calm, which further confused and terrified his victims. The connection between pleasure, pain, and power was entirely distorted in his mind, and his violent fantasies were becoming harder and harder to control. Reports indicate that Dayton collected objects from his victims as a sick way to relive the moments of the attacks. These trophies varied from pieces of clothing, accessories, and in some cases, even more disturbing items that were only discovered after his arrest. For years, Dayton managed to maintain this double life with impressive coldness. By day, he was the friendly mechanic, the father caring for his son, the man who fixed cars and chatted with the neighbors. By night, he became the relentless predator, hunting vulnerable women and fueling a cycle of violence that was increasingly difficult to hide. This contrast between Dayton's two faces is one of the most disturbing elements of his story. How can someone live two such opposing realities and avoid being discovered for so long? The answer lies in his manipulative ability and how he exploited the loopholes in society and the justice system. Unfortunately, women working on the streets were often ignored or discredited by the authorities. This scenario created the perfect environment for Dayton to continue his escalation of violence without major risks. Even when some victims escaped and reported assaults, the investigations were superficial, and Dayton always managed to walk away unscathed. Moreover, he knew exactly how to act to minimize suspicion. He avoided leaving direct traces, manipulated his story when interrogated, and, whenever possible, destroyed evidence. His coldness and method made him a silent threat, invisible to most, but the signs were there, even if many didn't want to see them. Small reports of assaults, women disappearing, rumors on the streets of downtown Portland. Everything pointed to something much more serious happening in the shadows. Gradually, the pattern of attacks began to catch the attention of observant investigators who, despite limited resources, were beginning to piece together the macabre puzzle. Dayton knew he was taking too many risks, but the feeling of impunity and the pleasure he derived from his crimes made him ignore any caution. His dark side was already out of control, and as we will see next, Dayton's escalating crimes would reach a point of no return, culminating in the brutal murders that would make him one of Oregon's most feared figures. Dayton Leroy Rogers' double life, which had gone unnoticed for so long, was about to be exposed in the most brutal and definitive way. Starting in mid-1987, what had once been hidden assaults and isolated attacks turned into a wave of murders that would leave the state of Oregon in shock. The escalation of violence began with the disappearance of women from downtown Portland. Sex workers, vulnerable women, some with a history of drug addiction, a profile that, for Dayton, made his advances easier. He knew these disappearances rarely received media attention and were often not investigated thoroughly. But this time, Dayton wasn't just assaulting them, he was killing them. His method was cruel, methodical, and filled with perversion. After luring the victims into his truck, he took them to Molalla Forest, a remote, dense area about 50 kilometers from Portland. Far from any help. In the midst of trees and darkness, Dayton gave in to his most violent instincts. The scenes later discovered by the police were described as terrifying. The victims were tied up, tortured, and brutally murdered. In several cases, there were specific mutilation marks on the women's feet, a macabre signature of Dayton, directly tied to his fetish and need for total control over the victims. For weeks, women continued to disappear. While the police struggled to find concrete clues, Dayton seemed to act with more and more boldness. But he made a mistake. On August 7, 1987, Dayton approached Jennifer Lisa Smith, a 25-year-old sex worker in Portland. Following his usual pattern, he convinced her to get into his truck. But that day, things didn't go exactly as planned. At a certain point, already in an isolated area, Dayton attacked Jennifer with extreme violence. However, she managed to fight back, was seriously injured, but managed to escape the vehicle and scream for help. The scene caught the attention of people passing through the area who, upon seeing the young woman's condition and Dayton's aggressive behavior, decided to act. Witnesses wrote down Dayton's truck license plate and immediately called the police. A few hours later, he was located at his residence and taken into custody. Unfortunately, Jennifer succumbed to her injuries shortly after, but her act of courage was the decisive turning point in the case. Her actions prevented Dayton from disappearing back into the shadows and possibly saved the lives of other women. During the investigation, police searched Dayton's truck and workshop. What they found made it clear they were dealing with something much bigger than an isolated case. Inside the truck, there were bloodstains, restraining tools, women's belongings, and even signs of burns. At Dayton's workplace, the situation was even more disturbing. Burned clothing, blood-stained tools including a handsaw and manual saw, as well as Jennifer's fingerprints. Faced with this evidence, the police began to connect the dots. The disappearance of women, previous reports, the pattern of violence, everything pointed to Dayton being not just a violent aggressor, but, indeed, a serial killer. But the horror was far from over. Days after Dayton's arrest, a bow hunter practicing in a remote area of Molalla Forest made a macabre discovery. Human remains scattered in the woods. Police were called, and within days, 6 more bodies were found in the same area. The victims showed the same pattern of violence and mutilation. All women, all vulnerable, all brutally murdered, and in some cases with specific mutilations on their feet. The scene was pure terror, something even the most experienced investigators would never forget. It was weeks of intense investigations, forensic analysis, and data cross-checking. The tools seized from Dayton matched the marks found on the bodies. The clothing, belongings, and biological evidence confirmed the link between him and the murders. The case gained national attention. The man who had gone unnoticed for so long, hidden behind the facade of an honest worker, was now revealed as one of the most brutal killers in the state's recent history. Dayton Leroy Rogers was formally charged and became known in the media as the Molalla Forest Killer. His coldness, the method of his crimes, and the macabre symbolism of the attacks shocked the country and left one question hanging in the air. How much longer would he have kept killing if not for the mistake he made by attacking Jennifer Smith? Dayton's arrest marked the end of one of Oregon's most terrifying manhunts, but the trial and the revelations that followed would show that the story was far from over. With Dayton Leroy Rogers finally in custody, the state of Oregon and the thick rest of the country closely followed the developments of the case. The man who had deceived everyone for so long was about to face the consequences of his crimes. Dayton's trial began in 1988 and from the start attracted major media attention. The evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, testimonies, the bodies found in Molalla Forest, and the disturbing details of Dayton's modus operandi painted an almost indisputable picture. The prosecution described Dayton as a cold, calculating, and ruthless predator, someone who showed no remorse and had turned his violent fantasies into a series of brutal murders. During the trial, forensic experts presented shocking details linking Dayton's tools to the injuries found on the victims. The investigation confirmed that the instruments seized from his truck and workshop matched perfectly with the cuts and mutilations observed on the bodies. Additionally, investigators presented personal belongings of the victims found in Dayton's possession, reinforcing the direct connection between him and the murders. The images shown in court, combined with the accounts of survivors and the victims' families, stirred emotion among the public and made clear the horror experienced by the women who crossed Dayton's path. Dayton himself, during the trial, maintained a cold and apathetic demeanor. At no point did he show remorse or empathy for the victims or their families. His attitude only reinforced the perception that he was an extremely dangerous and unfeeling individual, given the weight of the evidence and the severity of the crimes. The verdict was swift and decisive. Dayton Leroy Rogers was found guilty of the murder of Jennifer Lisa Smith and the other related crimes. The sentence left no doubt about the gravity of the case. Dayton was sentenced to death. The decision was met with relief and a sense of justice by the victims' families and the local community. The Molalla Forest Killer was finally off the streets. However, the story of the case wouldn't end there. In the years that followed, the legal process faced a series of twists that prolonged the suffering of the victims, families, and raised questions about the American justice system. Due to technicalities and legal appeals, Dayton's death sentence was overturned several times. Between 1988 and 2015, Dayton faced 4 different sentencing phases, all related to appeals, legal challenges, and procedural errors. Each of these moments brought the case back into the spotlight, reopening wounds and reminding everyone of the horrors of the crimes committed. Despite these legal twists, Dayton never left prison. He remained incarcerated in a maximum security facility in Oregon, while legal proceedings unfolded slowly. In 2021, the state of Oregon made a historic and controversial decision: the abolition of the death penalty for cases like that of Dayton Leroy Rogers. With that, the possibility of execution was officially ruled out, and Dayton's sentence was converted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, Dayton Leroy Rogers remains behind bars, where he will likely stay until the end of his life. His case, however, remains a dark reminder of systemic failures, the vulnerability of certain populations, and the darkest side of human nature. The story of the Molalla Forest Killer is not just about a criminal. It is a warning about how monsters can hide behind ordinary faces and about the importance of never ignoring the signs of danger. And above all, it is a call for society to never forget the victims and the constant need for justice and vigilance. The story of Dayton Leroy Rogers, the Molalla Forest Killer, makes us reflect on the darkest side of human nature and on the failures of a system that, for years, allowed a predator to roam freely among ordinary people. Behind an apparently harmless face hid an individual capable of unimaginable atrocities. Cases like this should not be seen merely as macabre curiosities, but as warnings. They reveal how easy it is to ignore signs of danger, to minimize suspicious behavior, and to underestimate the impact of untreated trauma. And most importantly, how vulnerable populations, such as homeless women or sex workers, are still neglected when it comes to safety and justice. Although Dayton is behind bars today, the scars of his crimes remain etched in the memories of families and the Oregon community. May the memory of this case serve as a reminder for society to stay alert, to question, to report, and above all, to protect those who are often invisible in the eyes of the law. If you enjoy investigative content like this, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave a like. Support is essential for us to continue bringing stories that need and deserve to be known.